"Get on the ground, or we will open fire right now." Those were the words the officers shouted on the night everything would collapse. But long before those voices echoed through the small apartment on Elliott Avenue, Aisha Thompson was still living through what she believed were her last ordinary days. Before we go into this story, where are you watching from? If this story means something to you, hit like, share it, and leave a comment so more people can hear the truth families like Aisha's fought to bring into the light. Aisha had finished another brutal 16-hour shift in the emergency room, a shift marked by the same familiar pain she carried home many nights. She had just treated a 19-year-old black teenager who arrived with a swollen eye, a bruised jaw, and the quiet fear that follows young men who have already learned not to trust the people sworn to protect them. The officers who brought him in said he had resisted a pat-down. Aisha knew better. She saw the pattern, and she wrote every detail in her small notebook, the one she kept hidden inside her locker. Case number 47. Another young life marked by hands that should have known restraint. She whispered a soft promise to him as he drifted into sleep, telling him he was safe for now, even though she knew safety was never guaranteed in a world that seemed determined to forget people like him. When she finally walked out of the hospital, her back ached, her eyes burned, and her mind kept replaying the teenager's trembling voice. She drove home as the sky barely held any color, parked her old car, locked the door behind her, and stepped quietly inside to the only place where she ever felt like herself. Mia, her 2-year-old daughter, slept peacefully in the crib, her small hands curled around a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. Aisha leaned down, kissed Mia's cheek, and let that soft warmth soak into her tired bones. She changed into sweats, checked on Marcus, and collapsed into bed next to him. His breathing was steady, but even in sleep he sometimes twitched, the old shadows of war tugging at him in ways he never spoke about fully. She placed her hand on his back, feeling the old tension that never completely released, and whispered, "We're home now." He stirred, turned slightly toward her, and for a brief moment his face relaxed into something peaceful. She closed her eyes, hoping that morning would be gentle. When sunlight reached the apartment, Marcus was already in the kitchen, moving slowly, fighting a flashback he refused to name. His hands shook as he cracked eggs into the pan, but he steadied himself when he heard Mia's giggles from the bedroom. He breathed through the tremor, reminding himself that the war was gone, that he was standing in his own home, that the past had no right to claim this day. Aisha walked in, rubbing her eyes, smiled at him, and said softly, "You were grinding your teeth again." He shrugged, trying to laugh it off, but she placed her hand on his arm, letting him know she saw everything he was carrying. She understood the weight without needing a long explanation. She had stood beside him through the worst nights, when he sat awake whispering into the darkness that he should have done more to save men he'd already watched die. She always told him the same thing. "You came home? That's enough." They sat together at the small kitchen table. Mia climbed into Aisha's lap, wrapping her arms around her mother's neck with the simple trust that only a child can give. Marcus watched both of them with a soft, guarded pride, as if they were the only proof he needed that he was still capable of building something good. Aisha told him she planned to speak at the city council meeting again, reminding him not to raise his voice when Councilman Dennis started dismissing the concerns of the black residents who lived in their neighborhood. Marcus promised he would try, though everyone knew his patience ran thin whenever officials pretended nothing was wrong, while families buried loved ones whose names barely made the news. Aisha leaned across the table and said gently, "We need them to listen, not shut us out because they think we're angry." He took a slow breath and nodded, wanting to honor her request even when his heart felt like a tight fist. Later that afternoon, Aisha finished charting the notes from her shift and added the new entry to her private list of cases involving excessive force. 47 names, 47 stories. She didn't know why she kept writing them down, only that it felt wrong to let those young people disappear into nothing. She believed someone needed to remember, even if remembering hurt. Mia tugged at her sleeve, wanting to play, and Aisha scooped her up with a smile that softened everything inside the room. They sat on the living room floor, building a crooked tower of blocks that fell every time Mia laughed too hard. Marcus joined them, rolling a toy truck across the carpet, watching his daughter light up with joy. For a moment, it felt like the world outside their door couldn't touch them, like the fear that always lingered had no place in this small circle of peace they created together. As night settled, Aisha finished folding laundry, placed her notebook in the drawer, and checked the apartment locks twice out of old habit. She didn't fear the neighborhood. She feared the unpredictable nights when sirens screeched through the streets and helicopters circled overhead. She feared the moments when officers barged into the wrong home, or pulled the wrong person from a car, or treated a warrant like permission to destroy a life. She stood in the doorway of Mia's room and whispered, "One day you'll walk these streets without looking over your shoulder." She said it every night, like a prayer she hoped the world would one day honor. Marcus wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though the truth sat heavy in her chest. She worried about the stories she heard in the ER, the broken bodies she tried to mend, the quiet ways trauma spread from one life to another. She didn't tell Marcus how many cases she'd recorded. He didn't ask. They both knew the weight they carried was enough without counting it out loud. They went to bed, Mia's soft breathing filling the quiet, and Aisha whispered goodnight to both of them. In those final, ordinary hours, before doors splintered, before commands were shouted that no one inside could hear, before one defensive shot would be twisted into a crime, before the city would learn her name too late, Aisha held her daughter in her arms and believed there was still time for the world to change. It began with a lie whispered by a jealous man who wanted revenge. A man who told detectives that drugs were moving through Aisha's apartment even though he had never once stepped inside her home. His false tip was folded into a stack of paperwork, and a supervisor signed a no-knock warrant in minutes, never pausing to question why a young mother who worked double shifts in the emergency room would be tied to anything criminal. The officers preparing for the raid talked about it as if it were routine, their voices steady as they repeated the same lines they used on every operation. But none of them carried the weight of what would come when they pushed that door open. They waited until the middle of the night, choosing the hour when fear is easiest to exploit, and stood outside the quiet apartment with their weapons drawn. Inside, Aisha slept with Mia tucked close to her, unaware that her final moments of peace were slipping away. Marcus lay in the bedroom, drifting between restless dreams and the old echoes of war he could never fully escape. He was the first to hear the crash. At exactly 53 minutes past midnight, the battering ram hit the front door with a force that shook the entire apartment. The noise was so violent that Marcus shot upright, heart pounding, mind racing through years of training that told him danger had already crossed the threshold. He didn't hear any commands, didn't hear anyone identify themselves, only the sound of men shouting over each other as the door splintered inward. His breath tightened, and without thinking he reached for the handgun locked in his safe. The same weapon he kept legally registered because he had promised himself that no threat would ever get past him again. He could not see the officers. He could not see their uniforms. He only heard chaos, believing intruders were breaking in. He fired a single shot into the ceiling, a warning intended to stop whoever was forcing their way inside. That one shot would become the anchor of the police narrative. the excuse they would hide behind, the reason they would claim they had no choice but to unleash what came next. The officers outside reacted instantly. Jordan Hayes, standing near the covered bedroom window, raised his weapon and fired blindly through the glass. He did not pause to aim. He did not wait for a target. He did not consider the possibility of a child behind the wall. His trigger finger moved with a speed that carried no thought at all. Bullets tore through the darkness, each one shredding the space where a family had been sleeping. Other officers opened fire as well, their rounds echoing through the apartment in a violent rhythm that lasted 41 seconds but felt unending to the people trapped inside. Aisha grabbed Mia from the crib, clutching her so tightly that the child woke up screaming. She ran into the hallway, hoping someone would hear her voice, hoping someone would stop shooting, hoping someone would see her child and hold their fire. She called out over the chaos, yelling that they had called 911 for help, but her voice was drowned out by the shots that followed. Marcus could barely see through the smoke and the shock. He shouted that a child was inside. He shouted that the gunfire needed to stop. He shouted because shouting was the only thing he had left. But the officers did not hear him, or chose not to. They kept firing into the home of a family who had done nothing wrong, a home that had never contained drugs, a home that had been chosen because someone wanted to settle a personal score. Aisha stepped into the hallway with Mia pressed against her chest, her arms wrapped around her daughter's small body, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She took one step, then another, trying to shield her child. In that moment, one of Hayes's rounds struck her, then another, and another, until her legs gave out beneath her. She fell backward onto the floor, arms still curled around Mia, trying to create a shield with her own body, even as life slipped from her grasp. Mia began screaming, a sound so piercing that it cut through even the gunfire. The officers did not stop until they realized no one was shooting back. When the last round fell silent, the hallway was filled with dust and confusion. Marcus was dragged out of the bedroom in nothing but his boxers, his hands pulled behind him, his face pressed against the floor as officers shouted commands he could not make sense of. He asked where Aisha was. No one answered. He asked whether his daughter was alive. No one responded. An officer yelled that he was under arrest for attempted murder. Another officer claimed he had heard them knock. Another claimed he had seen Marcus aim at them. None of it was true. None of it mattered in that moment. Marcus was taken outside without being given a chance to see what had happened to the woman he loved. Inside the apartment, Mia stood over her mother's body, her small hands reaching out, her voice shaking with confusion. She did not understand why Aisha wasn't moving. She did not understand why the people in the hallway were pointing guns at her father. She did not understand why her world had shattered in seconds. She only knew that she could not wake her mother, no matter how hard she tried. An officer eventually picked her up, carrying her away from the place where her mother lay still. Aisha's body remained on the floor long after the gunfire stopped, long after the officers finished searching the apartment for drugs that never existed, long after the truth had already been buried beneath the first layers of the official report. Outside, neighbors stood on their porches in shock, listening to officers repeat the same lines they always used. They said they had knocked. They said they had announced themselves. They said they had returned fire after being attacked. Marcus sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, waiting to hear whether Aisha was alive. He would learn the truth only after dawn. When a detective informed him without emotion that Aisha had died in the hallway while shielding their daughter, his world, already fragile from years of war and loss, broke open in a way he could never repair, in that single night, based on a lie that should never have been believed. The life Aisha had built as a mother, a healthcare worker, and a quiet advocate for her community was erased in 41 seconds. The officers walked away, claiming they had done everything right. Marcus was booked into a jail cell and branded a criminal before the sun rose. Mia was taken to a relative's home, crying for a mother she would never see again. And the city began preparing a story to protect the people who had fired 32 rounds into a home where a young family was sleeping. A story that would unravel only because the truth refused to stay buried. In the first hours after the shooting, before Aisha's name reached the wider world, the police department moved with the quiet precision of an institution that had rehearsed its response long before this night. The initial statement was drafted within minutes, written in the calm, detached tone agencies use when they want the public to believe everything was justified. It claimed that officers had returned fire after being shot at during a narcotics operation. It stated nothing about a no-knock warrant. It said nothing about Aisha being an essential worker who spent her nights saving other people's children. It offered no explanation for why she had died shielding her own. The department's spokesperson repeated the lines with practiced smoothness, and local television stations ran the story without hesitation, displaying a stock image of police tape as if that were all the community needed to understand what had happened. In those first hours, the truth was already being buried under official language crafted to protect the people who had fired 32 rounds into a home where a young family slept, while the police narrative spread. Marcus sat alone in an interrogation room, still wearing the same clothes he had been pulled from bed in, his wrists red from the handcuffs that had been left on too long. Officers questioned him as if he were the one who had caused the chaos, as if his single warning shot had set in motion the violence that followed. They told him he was being charged with attempted murder of a police officer. They said he had brought this on himself. They never mentioned that the officers had fired blindly. They never mentioned the child in the hallway. They never told him that Aisha had been unarmed. What they did tell him was that the cameras on their vests had malfunctioned. Every single one. They said it with straight faces, expecting him to accept that coincidence without question. Marcus sat in silence, unable to speak, unable to understand how the people responsible for taking everything from him could sit in front of him and insist they were the victims. Back at the scene, investigators combed the apartment with gloved hands, collecting shell casings and photographing bullet holes while ignoring the most important evidence of all. No drugs were found, no money, no weapons beyond Marcus's legally registered handgun. Nothing connected the family to any criminal activity, but the detectives didn't record that absence. They didn't put it in the first reports. They didn't mention it in the press briefing. Instead, they left the public with the impression that Aisha and Marcus had been part of something sinister, something that explained why officers had chosen to break down their door in the middle of the night. That false impression spread faster than the truth ever could, because silence from those in authority is often louder than facts from those in grief. Inside the hospital morgue, Aisha's mother, Tamika, arrived trembling, her face pale with shock. She had been told only that her daughter had been involved in a shooting, not that she had died. She asked to see her. She asked to hold her, but the staff could only offer quiet, sorrowful faces and gentle apologies. They told her the investigation prevented viewing at this stage. They told her to wait for the coroner. Tamika pressed her palm against the cold window of the viewing room, shaking as she realized her daughter, the child she had raised with hope and love, was gone. She asked why no one had called her sooner. She asked why no official had explained what had happened. Nobody had answers. Nobody ever does in those first days when institutions are more concerned with controlling the narrative than comforting the families they've shattered. Bianca, Aisha's younger sister, was the first to break through the silence. She refused to accept the early reports. She refused to let the city paint her sister as anything other than the person she was. Within hours, she posted photos of Aisha in her navy blue scrubs, holding Mia at the hospital Christmas party, smiling after finishing another long shift. She wrote that Aisha was an essential worker. She wrote that she was asleep. She wrote that she was a mother. Her post spread quickly, igniting a wave of disbelief and anger that swept across social media. It was the spark that the city had hoped would never be struck, because the truth has a way of traveling through pain faster than lies can outrun it. By the next morning, protests had already begun forming near the police headquarters. People wanted answers. They wanted transparency. They wanted the department to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. Instead, the chief stood before the cameras and repeated the same lines written the night before, avoiding every question that demanded clarity. Reporters pressed him for details about the warrant, about the lack of body cam footage, about the number of rounds fired. He sidestepped each question with a calmness that felt rehearsed. He didn't mention Aisha's name. He didn't mention Mia. He didn't mention the fact that the apartment door was nearly ripped off its hinges. He urged the public not to jump to conclusions, even though the department had already built the conclusions it wanted them to reach, while the city absorbed the official story. Marcus sat in a cell with his head buried in his hands, replaying the night in fragments. He thought of the door crashing open. He thought of the screams. He thought of Aisha clutching Mia. He thought of the single shot he fired. The shot he now feared would be used to justify everything that followed. He asked the guard whether his daughter was safe. He asked whether he could speak to his family. The guard shrugged and walked away. Marcus closed his eyes, praying for the strength to face whatever came next. It wasn't until 48 hours had passed that the first cracks appeared in the official narrative. A small local station interviewed a neighbor who said she had not heard the police announce themselves. Another neighbor said she had heard only gunfire, no commands. A hospital co-worker of Aisha posted her badge photo, stating plainly that the department was lying. Then someone leaked the first internal detail. No drugs were found. The city tried to dismiss the emerging truth as speculation, but the silence of the officers involved only made the public more suspicious. Every hour that passed widened the gap between what the police claimed and what the community believed. By the time 72 hours had elapsed, the story could no longer be contained. A local radio host said Aisha's name on the air. The phrase "say her name" surged across timelines. Photos of Aisha holding Mia began circulating nationally. Journalists started asking how an unarmed essential worker could be shot 6 times during a warrant that should never have been approved. The city tried to calm the outrage, but the truth had taken root in the minds of people who had seen this pattern too many times. They knew what happened when institutions closed ranks. They knew what happened when details were withheld. They knew the difference between accountability and performance. In 3 days, Aisha transformed from a name written on an incident report into a symbol of everything the community feared about the way policing had been carried out. The department's attempt to shape the story collapsed under the weight of the facts they tried to hide, and the nation began to watch, waiting for what would come next, because the truth had already escaped the walls built to contain it. The first march began with 20 people standing shoulder to shoulder outside Louisville Metro Police headquarters, holding signs that still smelled of fresh marker ink, their faces tight with grief and disbelief. Within a week, those 20 would become hundreds. Within a month, they would become thousands, and before the city understood the scale of what was unfolding, Louisville found itself in the center of a movement that refused to fade. The protests started simply, with neighbors calling out Aisha's name and demanding the truth about the night she died. But as the days passed, more voices joined, each one carrying its own story of fear, loss, and exhaustion with a system that had failed too many times. People who had never spoken publicly before stepped forward, holding candles and portraits of loved ones. Teachers marched beside nurses. Veterans marched beside teenagers. Ministers marched beside first-time activists who had spent years afraid to raise their voices. The crowd grew not because someone told them to, but because grief often becomes a bridge, pulling strangers into a shared purpose. And after Aisha's death, that purpose was unmistakable. The streets were rising to speak for those who no longer had breath. Marcus, newly released on bond, joined the protests with a quiet determination. He walked slowly, still shaken from the interrogation room and the nights in jail, holding a sign that read, "She was asleep when you killed her." The words felt heavy in his hands, but they were the only truth he could carry. People stepped aside as he passed, placing hands on his shoulder, whispering that they were sorry, or that they were praying for him, or that they were ready to stand beside him until justice was done. Marcus didn't speak much. He didn't have the strength yet, but he marched every day, his steps deliberate, his face set with the silent promise that his daughter would grow up knowing he fought for her mother's name to be cleared. Mia was kept safe with relatives, but her small drawings, hearts and stick figures, began appearing on protest boards, carried by strangers who wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, the city officials stood before microphones insisting that the investigation was ongoing. They urged the public to remain calm, but calm was impossible when people learned that all body cameras had supposedly malfunctioned. Calm was impossible when the police union declared that the officers had acted with professionalism. Calm was impossible when the community saw the first leaked documents from inside the department. Those documents came from a young investigative reporter named Tessa Duvall, who had spent her early career writing about school board budgets and community festivals. But when she saw the inconsistencies in the police statements, she followed the trail with the steadiness of someone who recognized a lie the moment she touched it. Her story revealed what the police had avoided mentioning. No drugs had been found in Aisha's home, no contraband, no evidence of any criminal activity. The warrant had been based on bad information from a source with a personal grudge. And officers had fired 32 rounds into a crowded apartment without verifying anything. The moment Tessa's report went live, the city shifted. People no longer asked what happened. They asked why it happened. They asked who approved the warrant. They asked why accountability was always delayed when the victims were black. Within days, the protests swelled to a size Louisville had never seen. Streets were filled with chants calling out Aisha's name, echoing through downtown day after day, night after night. The marches stretched from the courthouse steps to the heart of the city, moving with a steadiness that no one could ignore. Community leaders brought water and masks. Parents brought their children to learn what courage looked like. College students slept on sidewalks, determined not to lose momentum. Drummers set a rhythm that kept the crowds unified. Ministers led prayer circles at the edge of each gathering. Nurses stood together holding signs that read, "She saved our patients," who protected her. City employees who had never attended a protest in their lives marched during lunch breaks, unable to return to work without feeling complicit in silence. And through it all, Bianca Austin, Aisha's younger sister, became one of the clearest voices in the movement. She stood on car roofs and makeshift stages, telling crowds that her sister was more than the headlines, more than the police statements, more than the quiet death the city hoped to bury. Aisha mattered. She said again and again, "And you matter. And we're not going home until they admit what they did." The pressure mounted quickly. The city council called emergency meetings. The mayor's office prepared talking points that read more like apologies than explanations. Activists demanded accountability, not promises. At the same time, lawyers representing Aisha's family, led by civil rights attorney Lonita Baker, filed motions that pushed for public release of the warrant and the internal communications behind it. Baker spoke with the precision of someone who knew the system wasn't built to deliver justice easily. She told reporters that transparency wasn't optional. She told them the community had been misled. She told them that if the truth was not released willingly, It would be exposed in court. Her calm voice carried more weight than the official statements issued by police leadership. The marches continued for 180 consecutive days, the longest sustained protest movement in the city's history. People marched through heat, through rain, through discouragement, through threats, through exhaustion. What kept them moving wasn't anger alone. It was love. Love for Aisha. Love for Mia. Love for a future in which no mother's name would need to become a rallying cry. Each night, families placed candles at makeshift memorials, lighting enough small flames to create a glow that reached down entire blocks. On certain evenings, Marcus stood near the candlelight, holding Mia's stuffed rabbit, staring at the flickering rows of memory and grief. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had become its own kind of testimony. Behind the scenes, the Justice Department took notice. The scale of the protests, the leaked documents, the inconsistencies in the official statements, the pattern of similar incidents in the city's past, all of it forced the federal government to step in. A pattern or practice investigation was launched, signaling that the problems in Louisville were larger than one raid, larger than one set of officers, larger than one night gone wrong. It was a public declaration that something systemic had been exposed, and as soon as that investigation began, the city's tone shifted from confident to defensive. The chief placed Jordan Hayes on paid leave, calling it a standard procedure. The police union held a press conference, insisting that Hayes had acted appropriately, but their arguments were drowned out by the sound of thousands of feet marching through the streets, carrying the truth that could no longer be dismissed. By the time summer faded, it was clear the city was no longer dealing with an isolated tragedy. It was confronting a reckoning. Aisha's name was now spoken across the nation. Her story had become part of a movement too large to contain. And the people who marched for her understood one simple truth. They were not only seeking justice for Aisha, they were fighting to ensure that no other family would endure what hers had endured. The streets had risen, and they were not coming down. As the protests continued, and the truth became impossible to deny, the city found itself pushed into a corner where silence was no longer an option. Meetings that once dismissed community concerns now took place behind closed doors, with voices raised and faces pale. City attorneys warned that the evidence was shifting against them. Advisors told the mayor that the public's patience had worn thin, and every day the crowds outside grew louder, chanting Aisha's name with a force that felt like a drumbeat in the city's chest. It was clear that the people were not going home. They were not accepting excuses, and they were not letting the city hide behind the familiar shield of ongoing investigation. The momentum demanded something concrete, something visible, something that acknowledged the life that had been taken and the damage that had been done. The mayor called Aisha's family into a private conference room. He thanked them for coming. He said he respected their grief. He said the city wanted to help begin the healing process. But the family had been listening to polite words for months. What they needed now was action. Lonita Baker, the family's attorney, sat across from the officials with the calm precision of someone prepared for a long fight. She presented the facts in a steady voice. The false information used to obtain the warrant, the failure to verify the source, the 32 rounds fired into a home with a sleeping child inside, the cover-up attempts in the first 72 hours, the lack of body cameras, the contradictions in the officers' statements. She told them plainly that the city was facing historic liability, that they could choose to act now or be forced into accountability later. The city attorneys exchanged grim looks, fully aware that juries remember stories like Aisha's for a lifetime. After weeks of negotiations that stretched late into the night, the city agreed to pay $12 million to Aisha's family, the largest wrongful death settlement ever paid in Kentucky. The amount was staggering not because it could replace what was lost, but because it signaled something the city had never openly admitted, that Aisha deserved far better than what the system gave her. When the settlement was announced, reporters filled the room. Camera flashes reflected off tear-streaked faces. The mayor read from a prepared statement acknowledging deep failures in the execution of the warrant. He said the city was committed to reform, but the family, standing quietly behind him, knew the truth. No amount of money would bring back Aisha. No settlement could erase the memory of her final moments. The money was not justice. It was an admission that justice was long overdue. The settlement included terms that had nothing to do with money. Community leaders insisted on reforms to ensure no other mother would face what Aisha faced. Civil rights advocates demanded changes to how warrants were approved. Medical workers called for independent oversight of use-of-force incidents. And activists pushed for something bigger, a statewide ban on no-knock warrants. The proposal moved quickly, fueled by public outrage and political pressure from every corner of the state. Legislators who had never spoken about police reform before now found themselves confronted by crowds in their districts, holding signs with Aisha's name and asking how many more families needed to grieve before someone acted. Hearings were held, testimony was heard. And when Aisha's mother stood at the podium and spoke about her daughter's fearlessness, her compassion, and the way she had died protecting her child, the room fell silent. Her voice shook as she described the moment she learned her daughter had been killed. She asked the lawmakers what they would have done if it had been their child. She asked whether they would still defend a system that allowed officers to break down doors in the middle of the night without announcing themselves. Her words carried the weight of every mother who had lost a child to the same pattern of violence. And in that silence, the lawmakers understood the gravity of what they were deciding when the vote came. The statewide ban on no-knock warrants passed with overwhelming support. Crowds outside the Capitol erupted in relief. Activists embraced one another. Families wept. Ministers prayed. It was more than legislation. It was a promise that the state would no longer allow secrecy and surprise to be weapons used against its own people. The law became known as Breonna's Law, honoring the broader national movement that had sparked years earlier. But now it carried Aisha's story as well. Her name became woven into the fabric of reform, a reminder that real change always comes at a devastating cost. Marcus watched the news broadcast from his living room, holding Mia on his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Your mother deserved to see this." Mia rested her head against his chest, too young to understand the magnitude of what had been done in her mother's name. With the settlement finalized, Marcus used part of the funds to establish the Aisha Thompson Foundation, dedicated to supporting healthcare workers who faced trauma, burnout, and workplace violence. The foundation also provided legal aid for families harmed by police misconduct. Marcus believed that if Aisha had lived, she would have built something like this herself. She had spent her life caring for others, often without thanks. Now her legacy would continue in a way that carried her spirit forward. At the first board meeting, Marcus sat at the head of the table, still wearing his old Marine posture, but his voice softer than it had been in years. He told the board members that the foundation wasn't about charity. It was about dignity. It was about giving people the support Aisha gave every day without asking for recognition. Volunteers offered to staff the phone lines. Doctors pledged training hours. Social workers signed up to provide counseling. The foundation grew quickly, fueled by a community that saw it not as an organization, but as an extension of Aisha's heart. Despite the settlement and the new law, the family refused to step back from the fight. They held press conferences demanding criminal charges for the officers who fired the fatal shots. They reminded the public that civil accountability was only the first step. The protests continued, though smaller now, shaped not by rage alone, but by determination. Bianca became a fixture at community forums, speaking with a strength that belied her grief. She told audiences that justice was not complete until those responsible faced the consequences of their choices. She urged people not to let the momentum fade. She reminded them that Aisha had been an essential worker, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a neighbor, and that her story was not a headline, but a call to action, through it all. The family maintained a simple truth. Accountability was not vengeance. It was respect. It was acknowledgement. It was the only way a community heals. And as the state settled into a new chapter shaped by the law, bearing a name rooted in tragedy, the people who had marched for Aisha understood that the path ahead would be long, but they also knew they had taken a step that could not be taken back. A step that honored Aisha's life. A step that turned grief into purpose. A step that proved that the voices in the streets had changed more than a city. They had changed the law. As pressure mounted from every direction, protests, leaked documents, national attention, and the relentless push from Aisha's family, the Justice Department moved forward with federal civil rights charges against the officers involved in the raid. For months, the city had insisted that the officers had acted within policy, but federal investigators uncovered details that left no space for excuses. They found text messages revealing that the source of the warrant had never been verified. They found that the officers failed to confirm whether the target of the warrant even lived at the address. They found ballistic reports showing that Jordan Hayes had fired blindly through a covered window without line of sight, without warnings, and without restraint. They found internal emails where supervisors questioned the reliability of the informant days before the raid, but approved the operation anyway. And when prosecutors assembled the case, it became clear that the raid wasn't a tragic accident. It was a chain of reckless decisions, carried out by men who treated procedure as something optional. The trial drew national attention long before opening statements were delivered. Crowds lined the courthouse steps. News crews filled the sidewalks. Aisha's family sat in the front row every day, holding hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Jordan Hayes entered the courtroom in a plain suit, looking smaller than the uniform had once made him appear. He avoided the family's eyes, choosing instead to stare at the table, his jaw clenched as if bracing for impact. The prosecutors spoke plainly, laying out the facts without theatrics. They described the false intelligence. They described the no-knock entry approved in minutes. They described the firing of 32 rounds into a home where a sleeping mother held a child. They described Hayes' decision to fire without identifying a single target. And they described the aftermath, the lies, the omissions, the so-called malfunctioning cameras, the rush to paint Marcus as the aggressor. The defense argued that Hayes had acted in fear, that he believed his fellow officers were in danger, that he responded the way any officer would under stress. But the evidence told a different story. Hayes had fired first. Hayes had fired blindly. Hayes had fired repeatedly even after the apartment fell silent. And every explanation he offered was contradicted by the physical evidence. When the verdict was read, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Hayes was found guilty of violating Aisha's civil rights under color of law. His face tightened, but he did not speak. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it away, staring forward with an expression that looked more like disbelief than remorse. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge, a measured man who rarely raised his voice, spoke slowly, emphasizing each word so its weight would land exactly where it belonged. He said the raid reflected a grave disregard for human life. He said Aisha had been denied every right she was entitled to. He said Mia had been scarred in ways no child should endure. And he said Hayes' actions were not driven by fear, but by carelessness. The judge sentenced him to 33 months in federal prison. A quiet stir moved through the courtroom. Some felt the sentence was far too light. Others were stunned that an officer had been convicted at all. But for Aisha's family, the moment was not defined by the number of months. It was defined by the acknowledgement that what had happened to Aisha was wrong, unlawful, and unforgivable. Hayes lost far more than his freedom. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, ensuring he would never wear a badge again in any state. His marriage collapsed within months of his conviction. His children, tired of the harassment and threats directed at the family, eventually changed their last names to distance themselves from both the case and the backlash it created. His extended family left Kentucky, fearing retaliation from both protesters and police supporters who blamed them for bringing shame to the department. Hayes had once walked the streets with confidence. Now he lived in a small federal facility, counting days, replaying the moment when his choices collided with consequences he never imagined. Chief Harlan Brooks fared no better, although he avoided criminal charges. The federal investigation revealed years of mismanagement under his leadership. Officials uncovered ignored complaints, outdated policies, and repeated failures to correct patterns of excessive force. Public pressure intensified until the mayor announced that Brooks would be taking early retirement. It was a polite way of saying he was being pushed out. His departure did little to soften the anger felt by the community. 4 other officers involved in the raid were fired following internal reviews that confirmed procedural violations. 2 of them, overwhelmed by public scrutiny and internal departmental backlash, later died by suicide. Their deaths added another layer of grief and complexity to a city already scarred by loss, reminding everyone that unrestrained policing harms far more than its immediate victims. But the community refused to let the tragedy dilute the central truth. Aisha had been killed because the system had failed at every level. The consequences extended beyond individuals. The city's police budget was slashed by $47 million after a series of heated council debates. Community oversight boards were strengthened. New training requirements were pushed through despite fierce resistance from the union. The department entered into a consent decree with the Justice Department, mandating sweeping reforms, better supervision, transparent warrant procedures, de-escalation standards, and mandatory documentation for every use of force incident. Supervisors who had once ignored complaints now faced strict accountability. Officers who resisted the changes found themselves disciplined or removed. The culture of the department, long unchanged, was forced into a painful reckoning. Some officers chose to retire rather than adapt. Others committed themselves to rebuilding trust with a community that no longer accepted empty apologies. Through all of this, Aisha's family continued to move forward with a quiet strength that drew admiration from people across the country. They did not celebrate Hayes's downfall. They did not revel in Brooks's resignation. They did not treat any of the firings or financial penalties as victory. They carried themselves with the dignity Aisha had lived with, insisting that justice was not about punishment, but about truth. Marcus, though weary, spoke at community gatherings about the importance of accountability. He reminded people that Aisha had spent her life helping others, and that the country owed her more than a settlement or a conviction. Her name became a part of classrooms, sermons, policy discussions, and voter registration drives. Her story moved beyond the apartment on Elliott Avenue. It moved beyond Louisville. It became one of the cases cited in legal seminars, public safety reforms, and national conversations about policing. Even as Hayes began his prison sentence, the consequences of his actions continued to ripple outward. Officers across the country were reminded that authority does not excuse reckless force. Lawmakers were reminded that warrants should never be signed without scrutiny. And families were reminded that even in the darkest moments, persistence can force the nation to listen. When the federal report was released, detailing the failures at every level of the department, many in the community wept, not out of surprise, but out of relief that the truth had finally been put into words by someone with the power to make it matter. Aisha's name stood at the center of that report, a permanent reminder of what happens when institutions forget the value of a single life. For the first time in a long time, Louisville felt a shift, not healing, not closure, but clarity. And that clarity was its own kind of justice. In the years that followed the trial, Louisville changed in ways that no one could have predicted on the night Aisha died. The protests faded, but the memory of them stayed etched into the conscience of the city, shaping conversations in classrooms, council chambers, churches, and kitchen tables. People spoke her name with a softness that carried both sorrow and respect. Streets once filled with nightly chants now held community meetings where neighbors debated how to rebuild trust. Police officers attended mandatory training sessions that forced them to confront the failures of the past. City officials passed new oversight measures they once resisted. And across the state, families who had suffered similar losses reached out to Aisha's family, grateful that her story had pushed open a door that had remained closed for far too long. Change came slowly, often unevenly, but it came, and through it all, Marcus continued to carry the memory of Aisha with the quiet dignity he had learned from her, speaking at churches, auditoriums, community centers, and universities, telling audiences that justice was not an event, but a journey shaped by persistence, grief, and courage. His voice, once strained by trauma, grew steadier with each passing year as he learned how to turn pain into purpose. Mia grew into a school-aged child with the same serious gaze her mother once had. Teachers said she was calm, thoughtful, and wise beyond her years. She asked questions most children her age would never think to ask. She wanted to know why people argued on the news. She wanted to know why police cars made her stomach tighten. She wanted to know why her mother couldn't come back. Marcus did his best to answer her with honesty, even when the answers hurt. He told her that her mother had been brave. He told her she had saved lives. He told her she had loved Mia more than anything in the world. When the time came to explain what had happened, he spoke slowly, pausing when his throat tightened, choosing each word with care so the truth would land gently without breaking her spirit. Mia listened with the stillness of a child who understood more than she said aloud. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, and in that simple gesture, Marcus felt the weight of both the past and the future resting against his shoulder. The settlement allowed the family to move to a safer neighborhood, where Mia had a backyard to play in and a room filled with books, drawings, and stuffed animals. Marcus hung a framed photo of Aisha near the living room doorway so Mia would see her mother's face every time she walked through the house. On the table beside it sat a small candle that Marcus lit every evening. He didn't do it out of ritual or obligation. He did it because the light steadied him, the same way Aisha once steadied him after long nights filled with nightmares. The flame became a reminder that grief, while heavy, did not erase love. It carried it forward. Every year on the anniversary of Aisha's death, thousands gathered at the memorial dedicated to her. People carried candles, flowers, and signs with messages of remembrance. Some had marched during the protests. Some had never met her but said they felt connected to her story in ways they couldn't explain. Ministers delivered quiet prayers. Nurses recited the names of colleagues lost to violence or burnout. Children released small paper lanterns into the sky, and every year, as the crowd stood in silence, Marcus stepped forward holding Mia's hand, speaking softly into the microphone about the woman they had loved and the life that had been taken from her. He did not speak with anger. He spoke with clarity. He reminded the crowd that justice was not a final destination, but a commitment renewed with every step toward a more honest world. He reminded them that the changes they had fought for were not gifts, but responsibilities. And he reminded them that Aisha's story had become a beacon that guided countless others toward truth. Meanwhile, Jordan Hayes completed his federal sentence and was released early for good behavior. His re-entry into the world was far from quiet. He tried applying to law enforcement agencies in nearby states, but each department rejected him within days. His name had become synonymous with recklessness. His actions were now studied in training courses as examples of what happens when judgment fails. He returned home to a life stripped of the authority he once carried. There were no crowds waiting for him, no colleagues offering support, no future in the only profession he had ever known. He lived quietly, avoiding public places, choosing to remain unseen in a city that had come to understand the consequences of granting unchecked power to people unprepared to hold it. His story became a cautionary tale, not just for officers, but for anyone who believed the badge excused carelessness. And though he resumed his life outside prison walls, the world he stepped into no longer welcomed him. Aisha's name, however, continued to grow far beyond the limits of Louisville. Schools taught case studies about the failures that led to her death. Universities held symposiums on policing reform, citing her case as a turning point in national conversation. Legislators across the country introduced bills inspired by the movement her story helped galvanize, and community groups named scholarships, clinics, and mentorship programs after her. The Aisha Thompson Foundation expanded, offering mental health support to healthcare workers, legal resources to victims of police misconduct, and financial assistance to families navigating grief. Its impact spread into rural counties and urban neighborhoods alike, proving that justice could take many forms. Not all of them delivered in a courtroom. Volunteers spoke often about the gratitude families expressed when they received help they never thought they could access. And Marcus attended board meetings with a steadiness that reflected both responsibility and healing. In quieter moments, Marcus took Mia to the cemetery where Aisha was buried. The headstone was simple, engraved with her name, her profession, and a short line chosen by her mother. She healed with her hands and led with her heart. Marcus always approached the grave slowly, holding Mia's hand, letting the silence settle before he knelt down. Mia would place flowers beside the stone, usually the same ones Aisha loved, soft pink lilies. Marcus would sit with his daughter, speaking to Aisha as if she were listening, telling her about Mia's school, her drawings, her questions, her laughter, and her moments of courage. He spoke about the foundation, about the people who still marched in her name, about the laws changed because of her story, and when the words ran out. He placed his hand on the headstone, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "You didn't die for nothing, baby. You changed a city, and you're still changing this country." Mia would lean against him, closing her eyes as the quiet settled in. Marcus knew the path ahead would never be free of grief, but he also knew that grief had become part of their strength. It had pushed them forward. It had connected them to thousands who had lost loved ones in similar ways, and it had built a movement larger than any one person. As they stood to leave, Marcus looked at the headstone one last time, letting the peace of the moment linger. The light that Aisha carried in her lifetime had not been extinguished. It had shifted, spreading through the people who spoke her name, marched in her honor, worked to reform systems long resistant to change, and held their families a little tighter because of the lesson her story taught them. Aisha's life remained a beacon, and her light, steady, warm, and unbroken, continued to guide them all forward. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it moved you, please subscribe and give the video a like, so more people can hear the stories that deserve to be told.